say something?
I've got a tall face.
Yeah, because we made the microphone higher. Yeah.
Closer to my tall face.
Wow.
Certainly, I don't even know what day it is.
Hi, I'm Ollie Douglas. I have a tall face.
Yeah, hi. Tall face.
Tall face. I've never thought of you as having a tall face.
It's a stupid thing. I just said it, and as soon as I said it, it sounded stupid. So
There we go.
Yeah. Ready?
Off we go.
Hello, welcome back to the Absolute Units podcast. I'm Ollie Douglas, and I'm curator of the Museum of English Rural Life.
And I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media person.
In this episode, we're going to be talking to Hannah Lyons, who's our lovely colleague and curator of the University of Reading Art Collection.
We talk about art, rural life, and the surprising connections between the two.
Yeah, and some more absolute units, some big hogs, fat cow paintings, the works.
The works.
So it's not all plows and tractors and smocks here at the Merle. Our collections include archives, books, and works on paper. We've got everything from government posters about chicken feed to 18th century livestock portraiture. So how does art sneak into almost every museum collection, and how does it help us reinterpret and reimagine our understanding of the countryside? Here to show us her view of our galleries is our delightful colleague, Dr. Hannah Lyons, curator of art for the University of Reading. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Hannah, we're going to get on to, obviously, fat cow paintings and landscape art in good order. But I think it'd be nice if you kicked us off with a sense for our listeners of what you look after in the university's art collection and why and how that's different to what I look after in the museum's art collection.
Yes, that is a good place to begin. So I look after the University of Reading's art collection, which is about 1,500 artworks. Not all fat cows. So we have paintings, we have drawings, we have prints, we have sculpture, and even most recently we have a digital artwork, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, because it definitely covers some of the themes we're going to be discussing today. So those 1,500 artworks are housed in the same building as the Merle, but they're definitely arrived at the university via different means. So a lot of them, especially the drawings, were acquired by academics, especially fine art academics, over the course of the 20th century. And they're by European, mostly male artists, who give students at the university a taste of the old and modern masters, shall we say. So we've got artists such as Walter Sickert, James Whistler. We've got artists, even female artists, like Gwen John and Minnie Jane Hardman. And academics throughout the course of the university's history use these as teaching guides so that students in the fine art department could learn about, how to draw, basically. And that's quite different from your collection, which is, as we will discuss, tied to themes of English rural life.
But the starting point in a way is the same, isn't it? Because the Museum of English Rural Life has its origins in the Department of Agriculture and agricultural machinery and agricultural economics, and it's all about collecting things that academics think are important in order to chart that history and tell that story. And some of that, in fact, is about teaching. So it's about early teaching collections, but not so much the art. That comes in a little bit later. So that's a kind of interesting difference. Yours is very much a teaching collection for teaching, and the art in the Merle collection is stuff that's been accrued as part of a wider project that's about representation. So in a way, it gets that sort of coherence in terms of theme. You've got quite a broad-based collection. And that's interesting in and of itself, because there are a couple of things in your collection that could easily be sitting in the collection that I'm responsible for.
Yeah, there are definitely overlaps. What's also interesting about the University Art Collection, I think, is that correct me if I'm wrong, we started collecting artworks before the Merle. So some of our earliest works are from the very beginning of the 20th century. And the university, was acquiring these for no specific reason other than just for decorative purposes. So we do have some quite large paintings that do predate the Merle.
Yeah.
And though the university was collecting artworks, over the course of the 20th century, we, as a formal collection, are much younger than you because we were only formed actually 10 years ago next year. Wow. So 2015. So we are a baby. We are the baby collection of the university museums.
That's very cool.
And galleries.
Yeah. Yes. And the Merrill is cusping on, it'll celebrate its 75th as the university itself celebrates its centenary of its charter in 2026. So we're creeping on for 75. We're getting a bit rickety.
Whereas we're so young, you know.
So if we're talking about the Merle's collections, we're talking about something that was initially meant to be like a technological record of agricultural machinery and then later sort of culture and craft. What I want to know about, we have an incredible collection of what we know as the fat cow paintings. I really want to know how these happened to us as an institution. So 18th and 19th century oil paintings of livestock that is, to our modern eyes, I would say like comically exaggerated. Extremely large, extremely rectangular, very like noble and dignified pigs, cows, goats, sheep. Why were people making paintings of their livestock? And why did the paintings look like this?
It's the same reason. Yeah.
Same reason.
So you're talking about technological advancement, you're talking about agricultural improvement. All of that portraiture comes about in a period of agricultural improvement. So it's the 18th through to the 19th century, mass mechanization of particular processes. You've got the rise of factories, you've got the Industrial Revolution running in tandem with this. But you've also got selective breeding of livestock to make them bigger, to make them beefier in the case of the cattle. You're shifting from using cattle for draft animal power and milk increasingly towards using them for beef production. So you're getting meat from them as well. So you need them to be big and square and meaty. And in the process of doing that, you want to celebrate it. And how better to celebrate it than when you have a prize animal that's won awards at an agricultural show and that everyone wants to breed their livestock off. You commission a portrait of it and you commission them from really interesting artists. And what's really interesting from Hannah's perspective is that you then mass produce those paintings as prints, and that's your specialty.
That's where I'm interested. So so you mentioned that we have paintings, but we also have a lot of prints as well, which are traditionally less interesting to viewers, I think, because they're black and white. And they're seen as reproductive, and I'm putting that in inverted commas, and we can unpick that some more.
I would love to come back to that.
But yes, so we have paintings, we have prints. We also have these rather strange prints that have been transferred onto oil on glass, which I was looking at yesterday in the Merle, which are bonkers. So people were consuming these images of absolute units in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different forms. But as Ollie was saying, this is a period where, you're inflating the pig and advertising your wealth. But it also means that, there's a lot more. So in the 18th century, there's vast sums of money circulating and trickling down through to the middle classes. And people can afford to commission these kind of artworks for the first time, would you say, Ollie? We're seeing a rise in animal painters, in portraitists who are focusing on giant pigs and giant cows because there's a market there that wasn't there before. So I was reading that in the 18th century towards the 19th century, there was, I think it inflated from around 40 animal painters to 400.
Oh my gosh.
Just because of this vast market. People wanted portraits of their fat cows.
So can I ask a question about this? Because what you're describing to me sounds like Tinder for pigs, right? Where we have, I'm making a beautiful round hog through selective breeding because of mechanization of agriculture. This is part of the Industrial Revolution. This is part of urbanization. This is part of all these, larger things. But basically, I want my hog to look spectacular so that you will breed it with other hogs. And you will pay me for that privilege. Is that accurate?
Well, I guess, yes. So you, in a way,
okay.
But also you're also paying an artist to celebrate your hog, right?
Of course, to celebrate your hog. What I'm interested in is why would you then make prints of that?
Because there's a spin-off market.
Yeah. How many hog portraits of beautiful hogs could people possibly want for prints? Are these all direct sales?
Well, say you're a a landed duke in your country house, why should you just have a portrait of your giant hog? Why should I, in my humble cottage, not have a print of your humble hog?
But what do you want it for?
I guess I think these paintings are tied up with national identity and this notion of Britishness in the period.
That's really interesting.
And a pride in one's country and the kind of cows that we're producing.
So that's a really interesting point because, we're talking about the 18th and 19th century, we're talking about mechanization, industrialization. That's a period of time when a lot of people are making the move from rural living to urban living, going to work in factories. And at the same time, you have this rise, I think, correct me again if I'm wrong, of an artistic movement that's all about the pastoral and the rural and like rustic, traditional, quote unquote, British or English in this period life. Do you think that those two directions are kind of speaking to each other?
I think you're bang on with that move to the urban. It's in, I think, 1850 that you get the first moment when there are more people living in towns and cities than there are in the countryside. That's the moment at which the term countryside comes into being.
That's really interesting.
The country becomes peripheral. It's off to one side rather than being the center of everyone's lives. So it's also an amazing period of transition in terms of people wanting to have that connectivity back to the worlds in which their forebears grew up. And indeed, they might have grown up and moved into those towns and urban centers. So the desire to have a fat cow or a fat pig print on your wall or, of your terraced house or your cottage, it's part and parcel of that. And some of these animals went on tour. So there's a particular animal called Comet.
Oh my gosh.
And this is where the comparison with, a contemporary manufactured boy band comes in. There's an animal called Comet that goes on tour around the British Isles.
You keep saying animal. What was it?
It was a bull.
Okay, great. Because
just
saying animal is like
massive,
troublingly vague.
And we have in the collections, it's not part of the art collection, and not part of the museum's art collection, but we have a horn cup that reputedly is made from the horn of Comet.
Oh my gosh.
And it has Comet, the name scratched into the bottom of the horn cup. These animals were incredible celebrities. So, there's a massive parallel here between the degree to which the absolute units of the Merle have done the rounds as memes on social media. They were doing the rounds in the social media of the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Print culture.
Yeah. And also what's interesting as I've been dipping my toe into your world, Ollie, is that these were also exhibited in the 18th century in London. So not to get to art history.
That's why you're here.
But there's a really important moment in British art history, and that's in 1768. We have the foundation of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, which is the first academy of art in Britain. So we're way behind European counterparts. There's been one in Italy, there's been one in France. And artists have, for the first time, this space to exhibit their work. And what they're doing is they're competing, because if you went to an exhibition in the 18th century, it's not a white cube space as we would imagine today. If you go to the Merle, for example, or Tate, or wherever we might display art, it's usually white walls. They're organised very neatly. These were jam-packed from the roof to the floor. And there was a line going through the middle. All artists wanted to be exhibited on the line, of course, because, it's where people's eye would naturally go. And so artists were, for the first time, had this arena to exhibit their work. And so they were creating paintings like the Fat Cow paintings with an eye to exhibition cultures. And so they were trying to develop innovative ways to catch people's attention.
That's so interesting.
And so they are, people always ask, did these cows actually look like this? And of course, there is artistic creativity at play. But you'll notice in some of the later animal portraits, perhaps not the ones that we're looking at today, you'll see these beasts with exaggerated features, for example. And then if we move on later in the period towards, the period of kind of George Stubbs, they become more anatomically accurate. So artists are using, we're going back to the urban space, they're using this new exhibition culture to impact their paintings in really interesting ways. And I think we can see this at play in some of the Merle cow portraits.
And actually, our livestock portraiture in the galleries is echoing, clearly not very well, but it's echoing a cell on hang.
Yeah,
It's
it
trying to look a little bit denser. So if anyone's seen the big hog that's been doing the rounds on social media, which is a Richard Whitford painting from 1872 of a pig that won the Cardiff Agricultural Show, it's actually hung quite high up, and it's quite hard to make out the details that perhaps are becoming ever clearer as the hog is growing larger and larger online. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess you are the opposite of a white cube space, really, aren't you, in the Merle? But I think if we had a bunch of students in, like when we have our fine art students in, they want a white cube space, don't they, to kind of hang their work and let these works speak for themselves. But it's absolutely the opposite of that.
Yeah. White cube space and dipping the toes in the Merle collection, as you were describing it earlier, Hannah. I'm not sure that fits.
No,
it's a mucky, messy brown kind of muddy collection.
That's how we like it, though.
Yeah. It is. That's how we like it. And also, speaking about the future of sort of artistic interventions in the Merle, there's a lot of interesting sort of points of connection that we can get into shortly.
So I think white cube spaces might be a really nice jumping off point for another chunk of what we were going to talk about, and it is quite chunky in various different ways. And that connects to the idea of contemporary collecting. So obviously the Museum of English Rural Life is continuing to collect objects that represent the kind of heritage craft. It's continuing to collect lots of different kinds of material, but we're also continuing to collect contemporary artwork as well. And I know that that's something that you're interested in doing in terms of expanding the university art collection. So I wonder whether you could lead us in by talking a little bit about your ambitions for the university art collection, and then maybe we can pivot to talking a little bit more about the Merle's weird contemporary art interests.
Yes. I am really keen to continue working with contemporary artists. So the university art collection, like the Merle one, is not static. We have artworks from the 16th century, and we like to work with artists now. And considering, my research interests are tied to dead artists, it's really exciting when you get to work with people who are living and breathing and sharing their ideas about the collection with you. And I think it can produce some really interesting works. And for us in the University Art Collection, there are certain gaps in our holdings that don't address contemporary issues. And I think working with artists can shed, new light on the collection, address those gaps. And it also allows us to work with new audiences, which I know is something that you're keen on doing at Merle. Working with contemporary artists and working with you guys to, engage new audiences with the Merle holdings is something I'm really excited about. But I know that you did work on some really cool projects previously. Especially one that springs to my mind is Sire, which jumps off the back of the livestock portraiture we were just talking about. So did you want to tell us a bit more about Sire, Ollie?
Yeah, so Sire was a project devised by an artist called Maria McKinney. And Maria's an Irish artist, and she was interested in working with livestock portraiture. So she came many years ago now. I think it was probably back in about 2013, I'm guessing. And she looked at all of our fat cow and fat sheep and fat pig paintings, all of those 18th and 19th century prints and paintings we were talking about earlier. And she also looked at all of our strawcraft collections. So we're talking about things that are commonly known as corn dollies.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that Maria is really interested in ideas of regionalism. So she could see in these livestock portraits the defining moment for setting out what constitute now what we would refer to as native breeds. So these traditional native breed boundaries are being defined when those portraits are being made. But also, strawcraft is regional in terms of the way it's sort of created. So you have particular regional designs. You have a thing called a neck from the southwest of England, which is not really like a neck, but it's a long, twisted straw stick in a way. And you also have these sort of particular St. Bridget's crosses from Ireland, and so regional traditions.
Yeah.
So she's drawing a parallel between these different senses of regionalism, and she wanted to do that through the contemporary lens of livestock breeding. So what she did was she looked at all of this inspirational stuff. She went away. She built a project in partnership with a bunch of genetics specialists in Dublin who'd been working with a sire company. And a sire company is a company that breeds bulls to produce semen for selective breeding. So they're shipping off bull semen around the world in order to improve, quote unquote, particular lines of cattle. And she took exactly the side-on trope, that side-on perspective that you see in those big fat cow paintings, but she did it with contemporary bulls in this sire company. So these are huge portraits. We have one in the collection. We displayed all of them when she produced all of that artwork. But what's even more interesting is the fact that she also made, in parallel with that, a series of sculptures using traditional strawcraft techniques, which pick up on aspects of what people were desirous of breeding into their cattle. So that might be higher milk yields, or it might be other things to do with their beefiness. And she made those strawcraft sculptures not using straw, but using semen straws.
Wow.
So these are plastic straws.
Sorry, what?
These are small plastic, colourful straws used in the process of artificially inseminating cattle. They weren't used ones. So at least I don't think they were used ones.
And they're super colourful, aren't they?
They're super colourful.
For a reason.
Yeah, and the sculptures get sat on the back of the bulls, and they feature in the portraits. So imagine, if you will, a relatively small and nervous-looking farmhand holding the halter of a giant bull of a particular breed with a very exciting, colourful sculpture balanced on its back on a bespoke saddle. So the one that we have is a Hereford. It's chunky. It's got big brown shoulders, white head. There's a flat-capped guy holding it. In the background, there's a big black shed, and set against that shed, really colourfully, is a graph, which starts actually with sort of traditional strawcraft at one end, rising into a kind of upward arc of colourful twisted semen straws.
So the graph is made out of strawcraft.
The graph is made out of strawcraft and sort of semen strawcraft.
And it's strapped onto the bull's back.
And it represents, I think, something to do with rising milk yields or some sort of aspect of what you might want to breed into various forms of cattle.
I wanted to circle back to this, and I'm not sure whether this is something we can answer specifically, but I was thinking about the relative rectangularity of the traditional quote-unquote livestock portraits from the 18th and 19th century. And these bulls look a lot different to that. Some of them have nipped-in waists, some of them have really overdeveloped shoulders, and it seems as though they're being selectively bred to quote-unquote improve these lines towards different ends and different goals that have made them look or seem really different. And I wonder if that has to do with what she's investigating in terms of a more data-driven approach and a more international approach. You said that these, bull semen gets shipped around the world internationally. Is there some kind of standard, I wonder, for like peak bull, what they should be, what they should do? I don't know. I think it's fascinating. And also, I wanted to know a little bit more about the origins of strawcraft, because presumably they weren't originally beautiful 3D sculptures you would strap to animals. Why would you make a corn dolly in the first instance?
Well, I mean, this ties neatly into some sort of aspects of art history in a way, because essentially the popular story of strawcraft is born out of the romantic imaginings of a late 19th century anthropologist called James George Fraser.
Oh, so it's not even a thing.
And he writes, well, no, it is a thing.
Okay.
And they are a traditional thing. There's a regional tradition, throughout lots of parts of Europe of making these particular little craft sculptural pieces. There is undeniably some sort of connectivity to the way in which you work the land and things that you might want to do in connection with the land. The problem comes when the popular story is one that Fraser expounds, which is about this idea of some sort of pan-European corn spirit, a kind of European cult of that there is some animate spirit that somehow farmers have to regenerate through the process of making corn dullies with the last sheep of the harvest and ploughing them into the soil with the first ploughing in the spring.
Wow.
Now, those things are true. People did do that. They took the last sheaf of the harvest or something akin to it. They made a little sculpture. They kept it in their house, maybe by the hearth, and then they maybe did something like chuck it in and plough it in, or maybe they just kept hold of it because it was pretty, you know. But the idea that there's some sort of pan-European religion all centered on the same spiritual being, a corn spirit, is the romantic imaginings of late 19th century anthropology. And that idea of romanticization plays a massive role in art history as well.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about landscape painting a little later. But what I love about this is exactly what, you know, both of you have been talking about, is that her work operates on so many levels. And, you know, we're talking about kind of folk cultures, I guess, but also she's riffing off livestock portraiture. And I think that's what's really interesting about the ways in which you have been engaging contemporary artists with the Merle collection, is that, you know, there's so much going on here. I've just learned so much about these that I had no idea about. But people should go to the Merle and go upstairs and pull out the racking and look at these, because what we can't convey over the microphone is the absolute scale of these photographs, because they're, how high are they, Ollie? How big are they? Like over 1.5 meters?
They're over 1 meter high and they're over 2 meters wide.
Wow.
So they're big. They're big prints.
They're big prints.
Big prints of big cows, or big bulls, I should say. Yeah.
And you know, you have them displayed. We have one in the Merle collection, right? But it was how many displayed altogether when you did the exhibition? 12? 10?
9, I think. Yeah.
9.
So another nice thing, which ties into something that you were both picking up on before, is that this was all funded by the Wellcome Trust. So the Wellcome Trust is obviously focused on a much more scientific understanding of the world. It's a trust that's focused on global health, and plays a part in all of those big conversations about the pandemic and the aftermath of the pandemic and sort of improving health globally. And yet they're really interested in funding this kind of work as well. And the reason for that is it connects these worlds of sort of livestock health through to human health. There's a sort of concept called One Health, which is not just about humans, but it's that more than human idea. And the idea that art can play a powerful role in that as well is really important. And I think that's something that I would like to pick up on just again in relation to something you were saying earlier, Hannah, about expanding the art collections and expanding the Merle collections in new directions. The reason we do that with the Merle collection is exactly what you were talking about. We have gaps in the collection, or things that we somehow can't accommodate and represent. You know, we don't have enough space to have live examples of native breed bulls lurking around in the back garden, and it'd probably be a health and safety nightmare if we did. So instead, we need to represent those aspects of the agricultural world and the livestock breeding world in other ways, and contemporary art affords us an opportunity to do that. And we also did that through a lottery-funded project some years ago to try and bring the collections up to date. And agriculture in particular is a world where things become big and mechanized and difficult to represent. And art, again, is a really powerful medium for capturing those things that are difficult to capture, perhaps because they're too big, too expensive, or just simply too conceptually challenging to encapsulate within a material object.
Yeah, exactly. And you were saying we don't have cows in the garden, but we do have chickens, and they were born out of an artistic collaboration.
I didn't know that.
They were. Were they commissioned, Ollie, for the Merle?
It was part of 2 artistic residencies that again were funded through the Wellcome Trust. So one was Deirdre Omani, who looked at archival holdings and created a film piece that picked up on actually the nature of some of the corridors in the Merle building behind the scenes, which are terribly sort of pink and a sort of deep dark pink. And she picked up on that and sort of drew parallels between that and the rumen, the sort of digestive tract of cattle, and bound this into a kind of narrative that was to do with climate breakdown and the challenges of grass, the sort of Dust Bowl America and the risks of climate change for us environmentally. And then the other one, as you rightly point out, was the hen house in the garden was a project by Christine Mackey, another Irish artist. And Christine looked at loads of archival materials to do with poultry housing, and then designed us a poultry house for the back garden that was built by a local men's shed collective. I think that poultry house has since been modified and adapted to expand it, and partly because climate and weather, it's rotted away a little bit, and it had to be modified. But yeah, and that brings us all rather neatly, I think, to a piece of artwork that you have commissioned, or not so much commissioned, but acquired into the university art collections, that is representative of something that we're all facing, and that is very hard to capture through traditional modes of collecting. I think archives and objects and oil paintings, I guess. But you know, it's not a tangible artwork. It's a different kind of artwork.
So I wondered, Hannah, if you could tell us about the climate stripes.
Yes. So earlier in the podcast, we touched upon the university art collection and some of our recent acquisitions. So we were really excited that in 2018, we collected a digital artwork, the first digital artwork in the University of Reading art collection. And what's even more exciting is that it was made by someone quite close to home. And that's Professor Edward Hawkins, who is Professor of Climate Change here at the university. And many of you who are listening to this podcast will be familiar with climate stripes, even if they don't realise what climate stripes is. And that's because it's been used across the globe. It was beamed recently onto Tate Modern. You saw it at the Olympics when they were doing the marathon. It was on all of the billboards across the sides. And essentially, it is an image which shows clearly how the average temperatures have risen across the globe over 2 centuries. So it goes from blue stripes all the way across vertically to red stripes, and it shows how the planet is gradually overheating.
So how does he decide on what color the stripes are going to be, just for...
So the blue ones, the cooler ones, and the red ones are, of course, the hotter ones. So if you look at it, you can see that it gradually goes from a light blue to a darker blue, and then eventually over to this very, very dark red colour, which is where we are now, which is, of course, kind of climate catastrophe, really. We have passed the point, haven't we? And he made this image available digitally. So we have one of them in the art collection, but anyone can go online and download this. It's accessible to everyone, hence why you can see it at the Olympics, at Tate Modern. There are various news reporters in the States who are wearing climate striped suits. It's everywhere. But it really has an important message. And it shows you just how powerful art can be in conveying these really quite, this scary information, but also this really important information.
Well, and I think it's really important that it comes from Reading, because we like to pride ourselves as a very sustainable city, a very sustainable university. But it's a way of looking at landscape or our environment that's really new and sort of abstracted. I think when we think about landscape portraiture, we think of like fluffy clouds and beautiful trees and beautiful shining meadows. But I think it's also important to look at more traditional views of landscape with a critical lens also, because there's a different portrait of Reading that people might recognize more, but that is also really artificial.
Yeah, so in the galleries of the Museum of English Rural Life, we actually have a piece of art that comes from the University Art Collection, so something that sits under your purview, Hannah, which is a painting by Thomas Henry Hoffland, a view of White Knights, which is now home to the University of Reading's main campus, but a view of White Knights from 1816, so long before the university came into being, long before the Museum of English Rural Life came into being. And in that early period, during which those stripes are still blue on the climate stripes artwork, you know, this is the sort of beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, that point of Anthropocene change in terms of warming the planet. But it's a very different kind of artwork, isn't it? Perhaps you could describe it for us.
Yes, so we have this painting. It's not too large, I'd say probably about A3 size.
How big is that for people outside Europe, aka Americans, who don't know what A sizes
So if you think of a size of piece of paper, double that.
Okay.
Okay. And what it depicts is a very beautiful green rural idyll. It feels very harmonious. We have a path, which is to the forefront of the painting, and the viewer's eye travels along the path, and we see a genteel lady, probably sketching as women were supposed to do in those days, good genteel ladies performing their female accomplishments. And then the eye travels further down the path. There's some rolling hills, there's some beautiful trees, and then you'll pass the cattle, which are grazing very harmoniously. It's this kind of beautiful romantic world. And then eventually you come to White Knight's mansion, which is this white house, which is at the centre left of the composition. And then if your eye goes upwards, the clouds have miraculously opened and there's a beautiful kind of blue sky. And the eye is very much drawn towards that. And so this is White Knight's Park, which, as Ollie said, is tied up intimately with the history of Reading, because we are sat in White Knight's Park now doing this recording, but of course it's now White Knight's campus, which is the University of Reading's main home. And this painting was acquired into the University of Reading art collection in 1994 because of its ties with the history of the university. But this artwork is often used as a description, as an illustration for what the park looked like in the late 18th, early 19th century. But of course, it is very much a kind of this. It's an imagined idea of this stable social hierarchy, of which in the house is the Marquess of Blandford, George Spencer Churchill, who owns this land and is essentially the great landlord of the park.
The other nice thing about this, though, is that it's an artificial image, obviously a painting created to depict a landscape, but the landscape itself is also artificial.
What does that mean?
So the Marquess of Blandford essentially had people in, as was the fashion at the time, to design this landscape. So in the middle ground of the painting, you can hardly see it. It lurks behind some trees, but there is the lake at White Knight's. Now, the lake is still there. It'll be familiar to all of the staff and students of the University of Reading, but this is an artificial lake. It's a lake designed for a purpose, to look romantic and to look natural. The trees will have been planted and placed to create a sense of the natural and the picturesque. And then you've got the cattle, and the cattle and the sheep are, again, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, designed to look the way they are. Mm-hmm. They're fit for purpose, and they sit within this wider design landscape. The house, sadly, is no longer there. The older buildings around the White Knight's campus today are much later, so this house is no longer there. But the whole idea that the White Knight's campus today has these connections back to a point at which the landscape was being adapted purposefully as part of this wider move towards the picturesque, towards a particular romantic idea of the countryside. And yet this is all happening at a time when the challenges that we now face today in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of environmental breakdown, are all being kicked off as well. This painting captures all of that, and yet it's pretty.
It is.
It's nostalgic. It's evocative in all manner of problematic ways. It doesn't sit comfortably with the idea of climate breakdown or biodiversity loss.
Well, and what I think is so interesting is that, any piece of art is putting forth like a message, right? Or it has some kind of argument about how the world should be or how the world exists or whatever. There's a perspective there. If I had to put a word on what the White Knight's landscape was trying to tell us, it would be that this is orderly and good, and importantly, as Ollie said, natural, which I think is kind of hilarious, because if you look at the livestock portraiture from our first segment, they look anything but natural, and they're not supposed to look natural. They're supposed to look exceptional, right? They're supposed to look like the pinnacle of what a native breed, quote unquote, should look like. They're supposed to be the biggest, the meatiest, the most. And in the same way, this is a very artificial construction of what is meant to be a natural landscape. If you were to look at the climate stripes, I think maybe a word you could use would be urgency. I wouldn't necessarily want to say anxiety or fear, although I do feel those things, but certainly like urgency and intensity. And so I think it's important for us to look at what we're positioning as natural, because something like this landscape, looking at white nights, might be trying to get us to harken back to this kind of like ideal that doesn't exist and maybe never really did, was always artificial. And if we think about climate solutions today, we are going to have to look both to the past and the future to figure out what it is that we're going to do and how it is we're going to shape our landscape. Is it going to be natural? Is it going to be artificial? Is it going to be beneficial? And these are questions that we can answer and analyze through art.
Yeah, and I think this Thomas Hoffland painting is a really good juxtaposition with climate stripes. Ollie and I use it in our teaching to kind of encourage students to think about the ways that we can interrogate historic artworks and think about, reading them in different ways. In the 1970s, there was a lot of art historians, I won't go too much into the art history now, who were challenging this notion of this rural idyll and saying, rural idyll for who? For the Marquess of Blandford, of course, but not for the people who, were being, enslaved across the empire, and on whose backs the profits of these grand houses were being built. And I should say what's interesting about the Marquess of Blandford and White Knights Park is that shortly after this, he becomes bankrupt, because inside this mansion are all of his rare books. Mm-hmm. And as Ollie said, he landscaped the park to great expense, and he went bankrupt. So he had to sell the park and the house. And he didn't pay the artist for the paintings, nor for the illustrated volume, which we've not spoken about. And he ran back to his other mansion, which was Blenheim Park in Oxfordshire, which had been landscaped by Capability Brown, of course. And, this goes back to the idea of, Lancelot Capability Brown, he was the kind of king of making these natural, inverted commas, landscapes, right?
Sorry, was his name Lancelot?
Lancelot Capability Brown.
How many cool names does one guy need?
Oh, there's so many good 18th century names.
Lancelot Brown, you have to be... Okay, anyway.
We could have a whole podcast on 18th century names, but I'm not sure we get many listeners. But yes, Thomas Hoffland was never paid for this painting.
Wow.
And in the special collections at the University of Reading, there's also an illustrated volume of prints, engravings and etchings, which were designed by Thomas Hoffland. And what's interesting is that his wife, Barbara Hoffland, who is, in my opinion, a more talented artist, she wrote the text, and that was commissioned by the Marquess of Blandford too, to celebrate this, rural idyll. And they weren't paid for their labours.
Maybe this is her sketching.
It could be her sketching, yeah, exactly. It looks like a kind of upper middling, genteel woman. But she's certainly performing, the expected feminine duties of a woman in the 18th century. So, yeah, it's a really interesting image to unpick on multiple levels, but does make an interesting juxtaposition with climate stripes, I think, and shows that we don't just have to commission new artworks, though they are super interesting. We can really delve back into the Merle and the university art collections to kind of think afresh about these works.
And I think that brings us sort of full circle, doesn't it? It's really neat to be thinking that we're sitting within this landscape depicted in this 1816 painting that connects so strongly conceptually through to what the climate stripes are trying to achieve out there in the world. And we've got a new generation of students and academics in this campus thinking about these challenges, and they're not just thinking about them in academic silos. It's not just artists over here thinking about creative practice and climate scientists over here thinking about meteorological research and how we might meet these challenges. We're all thinking about it together. And I think in a way that connects through to the idea that the university's art collections, albeit they're not all fat cow paintings, and they're not all wonderful landscapes, and they're not necessarily all bang on theme with the ideas that the Merrill might want to focus on or bring conversations around. But they have a conversation. They sit next door to each other. You know, there are strong themes that connect in between the two areas, and they're all about big future challenges. They're not really about the past, or not solely about the past.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, that does it for this episode of Absolute Units. Thank you so much to Hannah for being here with us. Is there anything you'd like to plug?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. I would like to plug the University of Art Collections newsletter. So if you go onto our website, you can sign up, and that means you'll be able to find out all about our forthcoming exhibitions and events and Merly things we are doing with Katie and Ollie.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We'd also like to thank the Arts Council for making this show possible, as well as the wonderful people of the Film, Television, and Theatre Department at the University of Reading. This show is a production of the Museum of English Rural Life as part of the University of Reading and Museums Partnership Reading. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.